Today's mindful moment. For those of you who are always on the go, remember mindful moments.
Bite-sized knowledge, right?
Exactly. Perfect for those mental snacks throughout the day. Narrated by AI, too. What if the most powerful weapon in a nation's arsenal wasn't, a missile, but its currency? Today, we're navigating the surprising history of economic sanctions, a tool that has quietly but profoundly shaped the world stage. You shared a fascinating book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. And we're here to sort of extract its most crucial insights for everyone.
Exactly. And while sanctions might feel very modern, their origins are, well, surprisingly deep.
Right.
We'll be exploring how this instrument of international policy evolved, from the naval blockades of World War I through the interwar period and the lead up to World War II, uncovering its mechanics and its often unexpected consequences.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. World War I. The book mentions this early hope among some thinkers, the sanctionists, that economic pressure could actually prevent major conflicts in Europe.
Yeah, they even had this hypothetical scenario, didn't they? July 1914, Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Could sanctions have stopped it?
A compelling idea, right?
Yeah.
But maybe a bit idealistic.
Well, it was certainly a hopeful vision, but the reality that unfolded after World War I, it presented a different picture. Sanctions often looked like tools wielded by, Western powers.
Raising questions about neutrality.
Exactly. And their effectiveness really hinged on the big powers and the League of Nations sticking together, which, well, didn't always happen, especially by the 1930s.
The book really paints a picture of how much the war effort back then depended on global trade. Take Germany, for instance. Hugely dependent on imported stuff, especially manganese.
Essential for steel, yeah.
And Russia and India were the big suppliers. It just shows how tangled up global commerce was even before, the internet age.
It really does. The pre-war global economy was remarkably interconnected. There's that great example in the book about Brazilian manganese going to Krupp, the German steelmaker.
Oh, right, via the Netherlands.
Yeah, so it showed up twice in trade stats. Once as Brazil-Netherlands trade, then again as Netherlands-Germany. Imagine trying to track that during a blockade.
Wow. And despite Britain being all about free trade historically, figures like Robert Cecil pushed hard for the blockade against Germany.
Well, they knew Britain itself relied heavily on imports, especially food. So they saw economic leverage as a way to influence states they considered aberrant.
So strategic interests could trump free trade principles pretty quickly.
It seems so, but what's interesting is the logic behind it. These British elites, they believed in economic interdependence. They saw trade as civilizing.
So using those connections to punish bad behavior seemed logical to them.
Kind of, yeah. Consistent in a way. The war definitely meant more state control over trade for Britain, but it didn't necessarily kill their basic belief in global commerce being important.
And the impact on Germany was pretty significant, wasn't
Oh,
it?
definitely. By late 1916, they'd lost their main manganese sources, had to scramble for alternatives, and then rising shipping costs just made everything worse. It was like a slow squeeze.
Relentless economic strangulation.
Precisely. And the book highlights something often overlooked: the Anglo-French blockade of the Ottoman Empire.
In the Mediterranean.
Yes, and the consequences were devastating. Possibly hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths in Greater Syria from, well, starvation.
That's sobering. A reminder that even if you're not targeting civilians, economic weapons can cause immense humanitarian suffering.
Exactly.
So after the war, the Allies didn't stop using economic pressure, did they?
Yeah.
Against revolutionary regimes like in Russia and Hungary in 1919.
No, they kept using it. But that sparked a huge debate about the ethics. Was this economic warfare against civilians in peacetime? It wasn't, universally popular.
I can imagine. Who was pushing back?
Well, the book mentions feminist groups, humanitarian organizations, leftist groups. They all raised strong ethical objections, advocated for restraint. They saw the potential for widespread suffering and questioned the morality of it outside of a declared war.
Those ethical dilemmas still feel relevant today, don't they?
Absolutely. They're core to the debate around sanctions even now.
Now, Woodrow Wilson comes into this with a slightly different angle, according to the book. He saw the economic weapon as a tool for promoting democracy.
Yeah, that was Wilson's unique framing. He essentially linked access to international markets with a nation's political system. It wasn't just about stopping wars between states for him.
So, more ideological.
Very much so. While the Europeans were maybe more focused on strategic competition, rivalry with German industry like Krupp, Wilson argued Germany should only rejoin the global economy if it reformed politically, dismantle the monarchy, basically.
That adds a whole different layer. Which brings us neatly to the League of Nations and Article 16.
Right, the big one. Severing trade, financial ties, travel with any state deemed an aggressor looked powerful on paper.
Intended as a major deterrent. And did it work? The book mentions the Yugoslav-Albanian crisis in 1921.
Ah, yes, often cited as an early success. The League threatened an economic cutoff, and it seemed to work, de-escalated the conflict. Well, just the threat caused the Yugoslav currency, the dinar, to plummet. The government caved pretty quickly. Some hailed it as the League's special weapon, finally proving itself.
But it wasn't always that straightforward, was it? What about the French occupation of the Ruhr in 1923? That seems more like military force.
It looked like it, yeah, to show a force. But the book argues there was a strong economic motive underneath.
Really? Like what?
Like reparations.
Yep.
Some in the British Foreign Office saw that France's main goal was basically to extract resources and money from Germany. The French themselves realized military sanctions weren't paying the bills, so they went for what they thought were the best sanctions, the ones that made the money.
Fascinating. So even within the League era, there were different ideas about how sanctions should work and debates within liberalism itself.
Definitely. It wasn't a unified front. You had this tension between using economic pressure for international order versus the traditional liberal idea of staying neutral in conflicts.
And ethical concerns kept popping up, like from Emily Green Balch.
Exactly. She raised really important questions about the impact on ordinary people, argued that the powerful would just insulate themselves, while the most vulnerable would suffer, a crucial humanitarian perspective.
And where was the U.S. in all this League sanctions talk?
Pretty wary. They were concerned about getting tangled up in international disputes,
Yeah.
but also about the League potentially interfering in what they saw as U.S. domestic issues.
Like immigration.
Like immigration, yeah. The idea that some international body could judge American laws was a sticking point. And also the Monroe Doctrine, the possibility of European powers enforcing League sanctions in Latin America, was seen as a challenge to U.S. influence there.
Makes sense. So Germany eventually joins the League, right? After accepting the Dawes Plan in 1924.
Yes, that was a big step towards reintegration, but there was a condition. Sanctions against Germany could only happen for flagrant breaches of the Versailles Treaty, a really high bar.
So a move towards stability, but with caveats. And even then, neutral countries were trying to wriggle out of sanction obligations.
Oh, yeah. They actively looked for ways to minimize their commitment to participating in any League sanctions.
Meanwhile, the British Empire was thinking strategically about economic pressure, too, even as the empire was maybe starting to decline.
Right. The Committee of Imperial Defense, the CID, was exploring how Britain could use economic leverage against potential enemies. It's an interesting contrast, the public face of liberal internationalism versus this internal strategic thinking.
A way to project power without costly military action.
Exactly. Given their stretched resources and global commitments, the economic weapon looked appealing.
Okay, this leads us to the idea of a positive economic weapon in the mid-20s.
Yeah.
Financial aid instead of punishment.
Yeah, France, Finland, Poland were pushing this. The idea was financial assistance to states threatened by aggression, complementing the negative sanctions on the aggressor.
How would that work?
Well, the Convention on Financial Assistance aimed to provide short-term subsidies, maybe for buying arms, and longer-term emergency loans. Henry Sterkosh, a key League finance guy, really stressed balancing this positive support with the punitive sanctions. Our channel, Mindful Moments, and our podcasts often explores these kinds of complex global strategies using AI audiobook analysis over on YouTube.
Interesting concept. But not everyone bought into this liberal vision, right? Carl Schmitt.
Schmidt, the
Yeah.
German jurist, he was deeply critical, saw sanctions basically as a tool of the war victors to undermine the sovereignty of defeated nations like Germany.
So skepticism about the whole liberal faith in economic interdependence.
Totally. He saw sanctions as inherently political, not some neutral mechanism for order, just powerful states using economic leverage for their own ends.
And did real-world events bear out some of that skepticism? The Manchurian crisis in the early 30s?
That was a major test, yeah. The League tried to impose an arms embargo on Japan, but the arms industry resisted.
Economic interest trumping collective security.
Pretty much. It showed the limits of international cooperation when powerful domestic economic interests were involved.
Then the Soviet Union joins the League in 34. Hopes for an anti-fascist front.
There were hopes, yeah. But when the Soviets actually proposed sanctions against Nazi rearmament, the Western governments got cold feet.
Why? Worried about the economic blowback on themselves.
Largely, yes. Fear of economic disruption often seems stronger than the commitment to collective security, even with fascism rising in Europe. Deep divisions and self-interest.
But the League did eventually impose sanctions, didn't they, against Italy in 1935-36 for invading Ethiopia.
They did, and that was historic, the first truly multilateral economic sanctions regime,
Yep.
most countries involved, a pivotal moment.
There's always a but.
Fear of a bigger war led to a really cautious, gradual approach. They crucially avoided the tough stuff, like an oil embargo. Mussolini himself apparently said later that an oil embargo would have forced Italy out of Ethiopia in days.
Wow, so they pulled their punches. The book mentions the treasury theory here, finance-focused sanctions.
Yes, favored by British and French policymakers. Target foreign exchange reserves rather than a full blockade. The idea, pushed more by economists than naval guys, was that squeezing finances would be less provocative but still effective long term.
Targeting assets, restricting payments, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Rather than physically stopping ships. But this gradualism was also a weakness, right? It gave aggressors like Mussolini time to achieve their goals before the pressure really bit.
And the U.S. wasn't really involved, which must have weakened the whole effort against Italy.
Hugely. The U.S. stayed largely non-committal. Stanley Hornbeck at the State Department basically said, as long as the U.S. is out, the League's efforts are doomed. That lack of unity sent a clear signal.
So all this experience, the WWI blockade, the League's sanctions, it really spooked countries like Germany and Italy, this blockade phobia.
Oh, absolutely. It fueled their drive for self-sufficiency, for autarky, the memory of the blockade, the recent League sanctions. It convinced the Nazis Germany was vulnerable.
Leading to things like the 4-year plan.
Exactly. Aiming for raw materials freedom, synthetic production, exploiting domestic resources, anything to reduce dependence on the outside world. Autarky, national economic self-sufficiency.
And Italy did something similar after the Ethiopia sanctions, developing oil in Albania, using propaganda.
Yep, same path, trying to build economic fortresses, basically. Reduce reliance on the international system, especially the powers that might sanction them. Synthetic fuels, even if inefficient, were part of that strategy.
So ironic that by 1938, Britain and France were gearing up for economic war against Germany, but then chose appeasement at Munich.
A stark reminder, isn't it? You can have the tools, but lack the political will. Munich wasn't just avoiding military conflict. They effectively handed over economic resources to Hitler, strengthening his position.
And meanwhile, Japan's war in China and the coming war in Europe were messing up their economic plans, making them more reliant on the U.S.
They really were. Japan's expansion strained its economy, and as things got worse globally, its need for U.S. materials, nickel, copper, machine tools just grew and grew. A major vulnerability.
Which the U.S. eventually used, starting with those moral embargoes.
Yeah, restricting exports. Not legally binding, but they signaled disapproval, put pressure on U.S. companies, and kind of set the stage for tougher measures later.
Then comes World War II. And the book argues this is really the end of old-school neutrality. Economic warfare just becomes central.
Absolutely. Total war. Economic measures were as vital as military ones. The lines blurred completely.
And you had things like Lend-Lease, which was the opposite of sanctions, using economic power to help allies.
A total game changer. The U.S. poured supplies into allied nations without demanding immediate payment. Economic power as a direct instrument of war showed the potential of economic cooperation, too.
So, learning from the League's failures, the UN Charter created a stronger sanctions model, two-tiered.
Right, a clearer framework. Economic measures first, but with the explicit option to escalate to military force if needed. Address that key weakness of the League, the lack of timely, decisive action.
And by 1945, the book suggests sanctions had become, well, more legitimate internationally than in 1919.
It seems so. Maybe the sheer scale of World War II made economic pressure look relatively less destructive by comparison. A sobering thought, but it likely contributed to their broader acceptance post-war.
And in the post-war world, sanctions became a common tool, didn't they? Used for things like nuclear non-proliferation, human rights.
They're very frequent. And the dominance of the U.S. dollar, the role of Wall Street, that gave U.S. sanctions policy incredible leverage, this weaponized interdependence, as some call it.
Right. That U.S. economic power provides the mechanisms to enforce sanctions globally. Actions in the U.S. can ripple out everywhere.
For sure.
So, quite a journey. We've traced this economic weapon from WWI blockades to its major role today, that early dream of preventing war purely through economics. Well, it's been a much more complicated, often contradictory path,
There are
with
lots.
unintended consequences.
Definitely. And looking back at this history, whether sanctions actually work seems to depend on, well, a lot of things. Clear goals, definitely. Broad international buy-in, how resilient the target state is, and importantly, whether the countries imposing sanctions are willing to bear the costs themselves.
That's a great point. Okay, if you found this exploration insightful, please do subscribe and share it. You can also grab the book we talked about using the link in the show notes for an even deeper look. And most importantly, keep thinking critically about the power and the impact of these economic tools in our world.